All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Dan Warnshuis. We're at Utopia Vineyard. It's February 4th, 2020. Dan, thanks so much for joining us today. We appreciate this.
Thank you, Rick.
So we'll start with the most important question. Why wine?
Well, that's a really good question, and there's, it's a multifaceted reason, but I mean, I actually was, I'll try not to go too far back, but when I was growing up, I grew up in Fresno, California, and I was a competitive swimmer. Swam for the Fresno Swim Club for 13 years, and I was an All-American high school swimmer, and I earned a full ride scholarship to Michigan State for swimming. And my high school coach, who was one of my mentors, he was a math and science teacher, and he was a swim coach. And I looked up to him, among other adults that I knew, but I thought that those were three things I liked, and I thought, well, I'll teach and I'll do swim coaching, and that'll be a great life. And so when I went to Michigan State, I was into sciences and math, and got a Bachelor of Science degree there, and was coming back to California to teach and coach. And when I came back to California, my parents had moved from Fresno to the Bay Area. And my dad knew a hiring manager at Tektronix, and he got me an interview, and they hired me. And my teaching aspirations kind of melted away at that point when they told me how much they were going to pay me. And I had, up to that point in my life, I really hadn't ever had really good wine. I'd had a lot of crummy wine and beer in college, but never really knew anything about really good wine. But my first boss at Tektronix was an amateur chef, and he was a wine collector. And he invited me to dinner at his home, and he turned me on to First Growth Bordeaux. And I became very enamored through that experience. And after I'd been working for a couple years, I converted the laundry room in my first home to a wine cellar. And I started collecting because it was something I aspired to. And after a few years, I filled up my cellar, and I learned a lot about wine because I was very interested in it. And I decided to get licensed, and I turned that into an import-export business in Napa, California. And that was my first foray into the wine business. I was more interested in the business side of it because I wanted to get wine cheaply, expensive wine cheaply. That was really my motivation at that time. But I did want to know about the winemaking process as well. And so after a while, I started to focus on the Napa wines and looking toward the up-and-comers in Napa that weren't famous yet but made really good wine. And I was able to help them market their wines because they weren't very good at that, and they became my friends. And so then after a few years, I formed a partnership with one of them, and we started doing custom crush work at Napa, and we did that for 10 years. And in 1998, that company dissolved, and I came to Willamette Valley to search for, by that time I had made a little bit of money, and I came to Napa Valley to search for the ideal place to start Utopia, which was a business card and a business plan at that time. And after a couple of years, it led me to a farm on Ribbon Ridge, which is now the La Prairie du Col Vineyard. That was in October of 2000. And when I got there, I was like, yeah, this is okay, but that's the spot right up the hill, meaning where my current vineyard is. And it wasn't on the market, but there was a little ranch house there, and there were horses and a pasture. And I drove up and knocked on the door, and the owner was home, and he ended up selling me the property on the spot that day. So that's how I got Utopia. And took me 2 years to get my first vines in the ground, and then I went from there. We had 4 plantings, and I've got 17 acres under vine on a total of 19 acres. And I've got 12 Pinot Noir clones and the 3 low-yielding Dijon Chardonnay clones. And my first vintage was 05, where I made 97 cases of an estate Pinot. Today I make around 2,500 cases annually from the estate, but then I make other little bottlings from contracted fruit as well.
All right, so we'll come back to Oregon, but I'm curious about California first, since it's always nice to take advantage of people who've worked in California. Tell me about that time in Napa. You talk about kind of the up-and-coming part of the industry before it became what Napa is today. So tell me about being involved in that and kind of befriending some of those soon to be big time winemakers.
Yeah. I mean, it was exciting time. There was a lot going on, and as a retailer, wholesaler, importer, exporter, I had a lot of distributors calling on me, both national and international. And so I would set up meetings on the weekends when I wasn't working at my day job, and they would come in and we would taste. And I had a good friend by the name of Ron Wiegand, who was a master of wine and also a master somm at that time. I think there were only 75 in the world at that time. And he was my tasting partner, and he taught me a lot about the sensory aspects of wine. And of course, I took a lot of wine appreciation and some of the UC Davis extension courses and those kinds of things at that time. But yeah, I mean, every week we would set up tastings, and I also had a circle of friends, down there that we would do dinners, and everybody had a cellar, so we would pull out older bottlings, and it was just a great experience. And I was very enamored with Burgundy, both white and red. And so if you're familiar with Burgundy, there's just tons of little plots that they make wines from in the different regions. And so you can explore it. It's like a lifetime of exploration that you can do on those wines, and I was really fascinated by that. And that was one of the things that really drew me to the Willamette Valley, was the fact that they were making world-class Pinot Noir. And I was a little bit of an anomaly in Napa because I kept hosting wine tastings for Oregon Pinot, and most of the people there didn't know that Oregon even made wine. I mean, every time I brought it up, people would say, "Oh, they make wine in Oregon? I didn't know that." And so I became kind of like known for being this Pied Piper of Oregon Pinots in Napa, and I had Oregon wines in my business, where everybody else obviously was selling California wines or imported wines. But I was kind of known for that.
Tell me about how Napa changed while you were working there. Obviously, you were there during the boom. Tell me about when you got to Napa versus when you left it. What were the differences? How had it changed?
Well, I mean, it was already pretty well established as compared to what you've seen in the last 20 years in the Willamette Valley. They were kind of where we are today back in the 80s, right? There were lots of big wineries still, and there's still a number of smaller wineries and vineyards. So it was a mix, but it was still a pretty, it was a pretty stable industry in those days. There was probably 250 wineries when I first got to Napa. There's around 400 now, versus the 100 or so when I came to Willamette Valley versus the 700 now. So, and Napa's a smaller valley, right? It's 35 miles long, not 100 miles long like Willamette Valley, and it's only 5 miles wide at its widest point. So everything is all vineyards. I mean, literally they blow up hillsides to plant more vineyards there. So it was pretty well established. It was a more mature business, but I was working with people that were contracting for the fruit from growers, and then taking them into places like Napa Wine Company or Laird Family or Round Hill or places like that where they did custom crush work. And that was cool because there was a lot of wineries in one winery, and so we got to go in the cellar and taste a lot of different wines from barrel, which was also very educational. And I don't want to drop any names, but yeah, sometimes our thief would go into somebody else's barrel when we're back in the cellar. Nobody was looking, but yeah, it was really an exciting time to be there.
So tell me about the shop a little bit. I'm curious, when you set it up, what was your ambition for what you were going to do with the business? You talked about great wine at a cheap price, obviously as the kind of the goal, but what were your hopes kind of for the business, and is that what ended up happening, or did something else end up happening with it?
Well, I was working in tech, and that was after 5 or 6 years, that's when the internet became pretty big, or at least was kicking off, and you were getting things like wine.com and things like that were starting to happen. So I had my brick and mortar location in Napa, right off Highway 29 and California Avenue. If you know Trancas, it's right there, and it was a warehouse essentially. But in the front part, I had a small tasting room. Basically, it was a round conference table, and if somebody would come in, it would be by appointment, and then I would ask them a number of questions about what wines they like and what their current tastes were, etc. And then I would taste some wines with them, and then based on that, I would mix up a case of white and a case of red, or 2 cases of red, or whatever, back in my warehouse. My warehouse was just rows of boxes of really good, like, selection of fine wines versus a collection, right? That was the business, and eventually I took all those wines that were in the physical location, I put them online, and I called that business was called Online Cellars, CELLARS. It's still out there, and that was actually successful business. I was able to promote it, and it's still going. So.
Must have done something right.
It didn't go through multiple ownerships like wine.com, or hundreds of millions of dollars in investment. So I did everything myself pretty much. And yeah, it was just a way to get access to high-end wines, at a discounted price. And, by selling those wines, then I could reinvest and get more wine. So that was great. But then, when we started doing custom crush, that's when I really got interested in winemaking and wanted to use my science background to understand that more. And I went and I did wine studies at Chemeketa, and that was pretty straightforward, really, given my background. And Utopia started producing in 2005. And I was making wine. The first year I was over at doing alternating proprietorship at Josh Bergstrom's winery. But then the year after that I left and I went to the winemaker studio. And I was there until 2016. And then I spent a couple years at 12th and Maple. And then in 2018 we purchased this property. And that's when I converted the building to my new winery and did my first crush there in 2019. About 45 tons we brought in and processed there. And it's a really awesome building. I'll take you down and show you.
Awesome. Excellent. Yeah. Excellent. You mentioned, last question about California before we get into Oregon a bit more. You mentioned kind of being the Pied Piper of Oregon wine there in Napa. Tell me the reaction people had when you did give them an Oregon Pinot Noir. Did the recognition grow? Were people pretty happy about the wines you were choosing?
Within my circle of friends, it definitely grew. And people were really impressed with the Oregon Pinots because, we would set up flights of blind. We always tasted blind. And so we would set up flights with, with Burgundies, and I would put in a ringer from Oregon. And then we would do, multiple flights where we would set up, different regions from Burgundy and then different regions, California, Oregon, New Zealand, etc. And the Oregon wines always did very well in the blind tastings. They always were in the top, echelon of the wines. So people were definitely impressed, and and I brought back a lot of Willamette Valley Pinot in those days for people.
So you mentioned kind of coming up here and looking for the perfect spot for Utopia. What were you looking for? What was it about this spot that drew you to it?
Well, the characteristics for this particular climate here, you need to be between 250 and 800 feet elevation. You want good ventilation to reduce the disease pressure. You want the proper orientation, right? You want the right soil types, obviously, and topography. And that site really had everything. It's at 500 feet. It's all south facing. It's gently sloped. It's Willett-Kinsey soil series, so it's marine sedimentary, low fertility, good drainage. And then, when I designed the vineyard, I did it a little bit differently. Instead of putting a couple of clones, I put 12 clones on smaller blocks of 1 acre, approximately, and that gave me lots of tools in the winery. Because of the varying growing season, it really gives me a lot of flexibility to blend. I ferment all the wines individually, and then I blend prior to bottling. So it gives me a lot of granular control over the finished product, I think. But at that time, nobody was really doing that. Now more people are doing that.
I'm curious. You had the idea of winemaking, but the vineyard itself, that's a whole different ballgame from what you were doing before. What gave you the idea to plant a vineyard and to kind of take on that responsibility and instead of just making wine?
Well, when in Napa, we were contracting for fruit, and when those contracts expired, the growers took them back. And so I realized at that point that to have the ultimate control, you need to own the land. And so I wasn't going to own the land in Napa. So that was why that was one reason why the Willamette Valley was attractive. I mean, if I could have afforded the land in Napa, I might not have come to Willamette Valley, but I saw the ground floor opportunity at that time, and I believed in Willamette wines, and I believed that it was going to grow and that it was going to become the next Napa eventually. And so I looked at it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, something that I could do, and so I just did it. I said, to do it, you have to do it. You have to take action. You can't just dream about it. And so, I figured, well, I'll buy the land, and then we'll go from there. But first things first. And I mean, I spent 2 years looking for the ideal spot. I didn't want to make Utopia if everything wasn't right, and as ideal as I could get it. So, as soon as I saw the spot, even though it was just a horse pasture, I mean, I could squint and I could see the vineyard, right there, the vision for it. And so that was inspiring, and I knew that I had something. And then when the guy just, blurted out the price, the first thing he said to me, it was like, okay, well, this must be meant to be, because I never thought that you would actually sell it to me. I just thought I had to ask. Otherwise, I would never know. And so it was pretty shocking, really, because I was living in the Bay Area and working in tech. I had my wine company in Napa, and when I left that morning, I flew up on Southwest. I left the house around 5 in the morning because I was going to fly back that night, and I was looking at a couple sites. And the last thing I said to my wife is, "Don't worry, I'm just going to look. I'm not going to buy anything. You think I'm crazy? And when I came home, I had to tell her, "Well, yeah, we bought this farm. We're buying this farm in Oregon, but you're going to love it. It's going to be great." And I have 3 daughters, and they grew up in the Bay Area, so they were city girls. So coming to the Willamette Valley, and believe me, Ribbon Ridge was pretty remote back in the day. It's changed a lot now, but in those days, there were no lights on the hills or anything. I mean, it was pitch black at night, and we arrived in September, and it rained for 6 months, so it was not. They weren't that enamored with their dad there for that first winter.
Yeah, I can imagine. You mentioned before we started taping, you were talking about the site you have here and kind of the work you're doing. Tell me about the Initial Vineyard and the work you had to do to turn it from horse pasture into vineyard that you wanted it to be. Well,
fortunately, that site was cleared. There were no trees on it, so we didn't have to do any logging or cut down a single tree. It was literally a horse pasture, and so we had to amend the soils and obviously rip it and disc it and get it ready for planting, and then you have to get your vines, and I wanted some vines that were pretty special, like heirloom clones that had to be made. They weren't at the nursery. We had to contract for them and then wait a year to get them. So minimum a year, and so that's why it took, among all those other things, to get it ready. It took 2 years from the time I purchased the property to plant my first vines, and that's why my first 97 cases that I produced were off 4 acres that I planted in '02, and then I did 3 subsequent plantings.
Did you have in mind a sort of a grape growing philosophy? You mentioned site philosophy that you were looking for. Did you have a particular way you wanted to farm as you were getting started?
Well, yeah, I mean, in putting together the vineyard, I talked to a lot of different, viticulturalists and winemakers, and went around and did a lot of research, tasting the wines and getting familiar with the characteristics of the different clones, and understanding the rootstock and clone combinations, and figuring out what I wanted to do, and that's what led me to want to have that variety of clones, so that I could make one way to make a more complex wine is by blending, having maximum clonal diversity. And when I started, I was blending everything together. So even though, in third leaf or fourth leaf, I was making a fairly complex blend of those clones. It started out being 6 clones, but it eventually got to 12 with the subsequent plantings. Mm-hmm. And then in 2010, in my final planting, I added the Chardonnay vines.
You talked about being Ribbon Ridge and how it's changed a bit. Tell me about Ribbon Ridge as you got here, and what is special about this now the sub AVA Ribbon Ridge? Why it is special among the AVAs?
Well, it when I came, there was maybe 7, I was like the 8th vineyard, I think. Mm-hmm. On Ribbon Ridge, there's over 40 vineyards there now. And more all the time. I mean, I'm planning one in the next couple of years, but there's been quite a few, and it's the smallest AVA of all the AVAs in Oregon. We have 19 now, and Ribbon Ridge is by far the tiniest. So there's less coming out of here, generally making it more valuable. It's a warmer AVA. It has the marine sedimentary soils versus the more volcanic soils that you see in the surrounding Chehalem Mountains and Dundee Hills and Yamhill Carlton. I mean, they're all a mix, but we're primarily marine sedimentary because Ribbon Ridge was created through the upheaval of the tectonic action 40 to 50 million years ago, when the mountains came up and the sea got pushed back. And this little strip of land, it got left behind. It was seacoast. And so it got left behind. So it's uniquely marine sedimentary soils throughout. Those are warmer and drier soils during the growing season. Mm-hmm. And in a cool climate, that helps the fruit to fully ripen, even in an average year like we had in 2019. Mm-hmm. The other thing about Ribbon Ridge is it's a lot of family-owned wineries. It's a place where people can come, and I think of it as kind of like this safe haven where you can come and be relaxed and comfortable, meet the owners a lot of times, and the winemakers, the vineyard managers that are all rolled into one, like me, it's just a place where you can come and relax. And if you want to learn about wine grape growing or viticulture or winemaking or what the process is or the philosophy, and not feel intimidated, to me, it's just this kind of, I call it a safe haven for wine enthusiasts. Mm-hmm. To come. And we've got a lot of famous vineyards in this very small area. So, we have a preponderance of small wineries, but big names, and, a lot of award-winning wines. Mm-hmm. And, I just think it's really special place for all those reasons.
You talked about learning winemaking, kind of into the career a little bit. Tell me about the process of learning winemaking and what it was about that specifically that appealed to you in where you were.
Yeah, I'm still learning, frankly, because it's more than a lifetime of knowledge. If you want to be a winemaker, then, and things, it changes. Your tastes evolve, your style evolves, but you have to have a good idea of what you want, or what you're trying to do, and what style of wine that you want to make. I mean, a lot of that is going to be determined by the region that you're in and the varieties that you're growing, obviously. But with Pinot Noir, there's a lot of different styles, and there's a lot of different ways you can go. And every decision that you make in the vineyard and every decision that you make in the winery is going to influence that final product and make a different style. And so, for me, it's always been about experimentation. One of the biggest things that I've learned is that if I like the fruit, then I know I'm going to like the wine. So, you'll hear winemakers often say, it all starts in the vineyard. It's true. You know, and winemakers understand that at a very deep level. Because if you have good, clean fruit that's fully ripe and evenly ripe, and if you've done what you need to do in the vineyard, in terms of canopy management during the growing season and aggressive thinning and aggressive defoliation, you know, early on without trying to hedge your bets and really go for quality. We farm organically. It's another thing I like about Ribbon Ridge is we've got a lot of organic / biodynamic farms here. And in my free time, I'm president of Ribbon Ridge Wine Growers Association. And our biggest initiative that we're implementing this year is a pledge that all of our members are signing to go herbicide free on Ribbon Ridge. So all of our members are going to eliminate glyphosates in their vineyards, and the eventual goal is to get everybody to be organic / biodynamic, which a number of us already are. But I mean, that's pretty cool, I think. And it makes a better wine, you know, makes a better product at the end of the day. And, you know, we're a lot of family-owned wineries. I live on my vineyard, so why would I want to spray poison out there, you know what I mean? So we have this really vested interest in the land and preserving it for future generations. You know, part of, you know, Utopia for me is the legacy that I leave for my children and hopefully my grandchildren. And so that's really important piece of it.
What do you want people to take away from your wines? What would be the ideal, say, reaction to drinking one of your wines?
Well, I want them to think it's delicious, of course, but I mean, I'm trying to make wines that are at the core that you taste the authentic fruit, you know, from the grape. And then with Pinot Noir, I want it to be, you know, I want to have the spice and the earth and the fruit, but I want the core of the wine to be the fruit, and I want the other more nuanced characteristics to emanate from that core. But I want it to be complex, and I want it to be, you know, I want it to be good in the beginning, the middle, and the end, right? So finish is very important, having the wine finish clean, and but yeah, for it to be true, authentic, you know, Pinot Noir, that's the main thing, and a reflection of the growing season. You know, we're trying to make the best wine we can, like everybody. I mean, hopefully, and that's the goal. But the goal is also to make it a true reflection of the growing season. And if you're doing things by hand and you're doing it right, then that's what you should get. You get this reflection of each year, and it's the uniqueness of each vintage that's so special. I mean, that's what I celebrate with my wines, is like when I taste, say, a 2011, which was the coldest growing season that we've experienced in the Willamette Valley since 1880, or 2010, which was very similar, you taste what happened in the vineyard, and you taste what happened with the weather and what happened in the cellar in order to, you know, in a year like that where you're going to have less ripe fruit, where you have less heat and less light diffusion and maybe a little thinner skins on the grapes, etc., that's really going to affect the wine. But then the things that you did in the cellar to enrich it, you know, in terms of stirring the lees or you know, whatever it was that you did, you know, to get everything out of those grapes, and then you end up like a year like that where you have this unbelievable silky texture and still really focused flavors, but everything's nuanced and it becomes more about the texture than the flavors, versus a hot year like we've had, you know, from 14 to 18, where you have this, you know, layers and layers of rich fruit and more tannins, and definitely more texture in the wine. But, you know, from one year to the next, you get this really unique expression of the wine, and so or of the vineyard, and I mean that's pretty cool.
We talked about earlier about 19 specifically, just coming off of that, so being such a different year than we've had. Tell me about dealing with that, especially coming off of 5 straight fairly similar warm vintages. What did you do differently this year?
So, well, I mean, it was a cooler year, obviously, and we had more moisture than we've had the last 5 years. So we had less light, less heat. If you plotted the growing degree days versus historic versus the last 5 years prior to this, you would see that 2019 put us right at the average pretty much, really, really close to that line. In terms of the amount of cumulative heat during the growing season. We did have moisture around harvest. I mean, September was wetter than October, right? We started our harvest on September 25th, and then we also picked on the 26th, and then we finished on the 1st and 2nd of October. So we were well over 100 days from flowering at that point. So the beauty of a little bit cooler year was we got lots of hang time, and so the sugars didn't get out so far ahead of the phenolic ripening that you see in those warmer years, and so you have a really balanced fruit. We were lucky because Ribbon Ridge is surrounded by the coastal range and the Chehalem Mountains, which are taller mountains, and since most of the storms blow in from the west, we have this little rain curtain from those larger mountains, and so the clouds tend to skirt over us more and we get less moisture. And so even though there was a lot of moisture, we got less of it. It's spotty, right? Like if you just over a few miles over, like in the Dundee Hills or Chehalem Mountains, they saw a lot more rain. And then the other saving grace was, unlike 2013 where it was rainy and warm, which created a lot of disease pressure on a lot of vineyards, this year the temperatures were cool, and so the fruit stayed firm. We didn't get so much moisture that the fruit got soft, and with the cool temperatures it kept the fruit firm. So my bricks on all of my Pinot lots range from 22.3 to 24.1 with lots of hang time, and really good, acidity and balance in the fruit. So nice pHs. I mean, didn't really have to do much with the fruit in the winery. And so I'm really, the wines, they're super dark and rich and complex. The flavors are amazing right now. So I'm really, really excited. I think there'll be some of the better wines coming out of the Willamette Valley because we got, everything that we're historically known for, right, in a year like that, if you did it right.
We're talking about being both vineyard manager and winemaker here. Tell me about balancing that. Obviously, those are both a lot of work. How do you balance your time throughout the year? I
decide early in the morning which things I'm going to drop that day, and then I do the other things, basically. But, the sun drives the vineyard, right? And so if you want to get the best result in the vineyard, then it's best to be a little bit ahead of things. And so I try to stay ahead of things in the vineyard. Like I'll defoliate a little bit earlier probably than most sites as soon as I see flowering. I'll thin my first thinning pass a little bit early, and then that puts me in a good position as things go on to do the other things that I need to do, and just stay caught up or slightly ahead of what the vineyard needs, and then get a good result. And good fruit makes good wine, and so it's much easier to work with good, ripe, clean fruit as a winemaker. So that makes my job much easier in the winery. And then it's just a matter of getting everything out of it, shepherding it, not intervening very much, not over processing the grapes, and just letting them do their thing and keeping them clean and safe, and just watching the chemistry in the must and the chemistry in the wine, and keeping things where they need to be.
Earlier, you were talking about what you grow here, all the different Pinot Noir clones and Chardonnay clones. We also talked about experimentation, so I'm curious, beyond what you're doing here, what else are you experimenting with? So
when I talk about experimentation in the winery, I'm talking like bench trials, right, where we're taking small volumes and rushing them through the process to check the effect of it. And then if we like it, we can apply it to some of the larger lots or volumes. And for me, I like whole cluster. I've been enamored with that. I've done a lot of experimentation with whole cluster where I've done partial whole cluster, 10%, 25%, 50%, 100%. I mean, we've destemmed the fruit and let the stems dry out and then put them back in the vat, to see what that would do. All kinds of different ways of doing it. and things like extending my cold soaks. So average cold soak might be 5 days. In 2013, I extended my cold soak on my Pinots to 30 days. Okay, so I mean, that's just kind of crazy, right? But I think it enhances the aromatics on the wine. So things like whole cluster fermentations, extended cold soaks, low SO2 protocols on the wines, not adding a lot, getting good clean fruit and trying to do this minimalist kind of approach as much as possible. I mean, it's not always possible, sometimes we need to acidulate the wine and things like that, but that kind of stuff is normal winemaking. You're going to lose some of that going through fermentations, and so that's just a matter of knowing the vineyard and being able to look at the nutrients in the must and know things and the TA and things like that, and know how to adjust. And you can do very quick bench trials. You can do 1, 2, 3, 4 grams per liter, and you can go, okay, boom, I know exactly what I want to do. But I always want to try and do the work. So that when I make a decision about the wine, that it's informed. And so I try not to cut any corners in the vineyard or the winery to give myself, the best opportunity to end up with a wine that when you come in my tasting room, it's like, I'm really proud of this wine because I'm going to be the one standing there pouring it for you, okay? It's not somebody that I hire to stand there and take the criticisms or the compliments or whatever. It's me, and I wouldn't want to serve you anything that I wouldn't want to drink myself.
With those kind of experimentations, are you looking at making like long-term decisions in terms of like whole cluster? Or is that a year-to-year thing? Is it based on your fruit, or is it based on more of I want to make 100% whole cluster wine? How do I get to that point? So
I like whole cluster a lot, and one of the things that is kind of conventional wisdom about whole cluster, it's people say, well, it's site specific, it's variety specific, it's region specific, it's vintage specific, it's all these things, right? And so the conventional willism is, you don't want to do whole cluster if the stems are green. So when you pick them, but the stems are always green in Oregon when you pick them in the Willamette Valley, even in a warm year. So one of the things that I've learned through my experience, and I do 100% whole cluster now when I do it. I don't like partial. I like to get the full effect if I'm going to do it, and just go on the margin and push it all the way. And I like the effect, but normally you would think, well, 14 through 18, where we had these really hot years, would be ideal years for doing whole cluster. And I did whole cluster in those years, but the ones that are the most interesting to me are the cooler years, like 10 and 11 and 13, where you actually get more of an effect because the fruit isn't quite as ripe. And so some of the nuances that you get from those additional tannins and how that affects the flavors in the finished wine, and then the effect of the spicy characteristics, if you do it correctly, that you get from whole cluster. So like some of my favorite whole cluster wines are like my 2011s, which probably most winemakers would not want to do whole cluster in a year like 2011, especially 100%. But that's just something that you learn along the way. Because making wine in California is different from making wine in Oregon. California, we have, obviously warmer temperatures. It's not if the fruit's going to get ripe, it's when it's going to get ripe, and how much time do we have before it gets ripe. And then we're adjusting, we're usually diluting the must in order to reduce the alcohol in the finished wine, versus Oregon, where you add sugar to get if you didn't do it right, which I've never chaptalized my wines because I don't mind lower alcohol either. I like the lower alcohol, more nuanced style of Pinot Noir, those silky textures that you get in the cooler years. And it just requires you have to thin more aggressively in those years, but if your goal is for quality, then, if I can make the wine 1% better by dropping more fruit prior to veraison, in my mind, that's an easy decision, because, and then again, it's all about the finished wine.
You were talking about making wine in California versus making wine in Oregon. Tell me about the industries in general. You have a pretty good amount of experience in both. I'm curious how they compare and contrast in this day and age. To the best of your knowledge, how does Oregon wine industry compare to California wine industry?
So you probably have heard this before, but there's a very collaborative nature in winemaking in the Willamette Valley. A lot of small wineries. You probably know 70% of our wineries make 5,000 cases or less, right? So in California, that's a very small winery, okay? But in Oregon, in Willamette Valley, that's 70% of our wineries. That's the preponderance of the wineries out there. And we have this, I call it co-opetition, right? Because we all cooperate. You know, if my sprayer breaks down and it's gonna rain tomorrow, but I'm only halfway through the vineyard, I can call my neighbor, and no matter what he's doing, he'll literally drop everything and bring me his sprayer so that I can finish spraying before the rain comes, right? If my neighbor is, you know, harvesting and he needs some more bins or whatever it is, I mean, or if we're in the cellar and, you know, he has a question about the wine or I do, you know, we're just totally sharing information, and that is something that is really unique in Willamette Valley in my experience. And I call it the multiplier effect, right? Because if you think about, we've been making Pinot, I mean, the very first vine was only planted in 1965, so about 55 years. I mean, that's not even a drop in the bucket in terms of wine regions. And look how far we've come. And it's not just us saying it. You see the big wineries coming here because they know we have a good thing. You see the recognition with the industry experts, you know, all saying that Oregon makes the best New World Pinot Noir, and it's pretty much across the board. So, I mean, it's widely agreed upon, right? And validated. And I think a big part of that is the fact that we are so collaborative. But then once you bottle the wine, you have to sell it. And so that's the competition part, right? And we're all competing for that same piece of pie. And so I like the term co-opetition because we'll help each other. We'll give each other the shirt off our backs. But at the end of the day, once we bottle that wine, we want to sell it. And there's only so many wine consumers. And so we're in competition in that way. But everybody here, I would say, or almost everybody realizes that our boats rise and fall on the same tide, pretty much.
So where do you see the Oregon wine industry as you look ahead, say 10 years in the future? What will have changed? What are you concerned about? What are you hoping for?
Well, I mean, I see some of the leaders here, you know, really pushing for, you know, maintaining the quality that we've become known for. And, you know, I support that. I think it's really important. I don't want to take away tools from winemakers. That, you know, blending is a big part of winemaking. My Pinot Noirs and my Chardonnay are 100% of the variety, but some people like to blend, you know, and there's, right now the rule is 10%. Most states that's 25%. And so we're already pretty strict. They're making it 100%, or they're attempting to. And, you know, that's caused a bit of a schism, I think, with some of the wineries. And, you know, I can appreciate both sides of the argument. It doesn't really affect me personally in my winemaking because I'm making 100% varieties. But for some people, it might affect them adversely in their style of their winemaking that they want to do. For Willamette Valley, I think there's 18 varieties that are going to be affected if that goes through. Pretty sure it's going to go through. And so I would like to see, you know, more discussion and more, you know, more understanding of issues like that before any decisions are made, and really understanding, you know, what are the benefits of that versus the cons, you know, the pros and cons for different people. Because, I mean, it's important that we maintain our camaraderie, and that we continue to, you know, to really keep that, because it's to me, in my experience, it's a very unique part of the winemaking experience here in Willamette Valley. So I see both sides of it, and but I do appreciate, you know, that the founders and the visionaries that started this industry, that they had the vision to make those very strict guidelines, and that obviously has contributed greatly to the success of Oregon Pinot. So, you know, it's always hard to argue with success, right?
Are there any other obstacles that on the horizon that you're concerned about that may affect the industry, vineyard specific or industry specific?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of, I mean, as a small business, you know, you're in agriculture, we're growing the grapes, so we have labor issues, you know, that's become a huge issue, getting labor, the cost of labor, bigger wineries coming in, you know. I mean, it's a double-edged sword. They wouldn't be coming here if we weren't successful. So like I said, it validates everything that we're doing, and it's a you know, it's a sign of success. It goes with success, but they can afford to pay more, and there are labor shortages. So, I mean, we literally have crews not showing up to work because they've been offered $1 more to go over to some other vineyard, and then every year those costs are increasing. And if you're a small winery, you know, you have to absorb those costs most of the time. You can't really raise the price on your bottle when it's already $50 a bottle, right? Because it's you know, pricing is a combination of what else is there, supply and demand, cost obviously is a factor, the quality of the wine, the perception of the quality of the wine, right? All of those things, the experience now that goes with it, especially with millennials, right? They don't just want a glass of wine. They don't want wine as a beverage. They want wine as an experience, like everything. And so, you know, those are a lot of challenges, and then we have all the regulatory challenges. You know, shipping compliance laws are a huge drain on our resources for a small winery. You know, it would be great if they could come up with a national rule, or just charge us one fee up front based on our sales, instead of making us go and report and pay taxes on a monthly basis and coordinate with multiple state organizations within every given state, just so that you can ship a bottle of wine and pay the tax. You know, we're happy to pay the tax, but make it more streamlined, because I mean, I spent 3 hours last week, I won't say the state, figuring out my taxes, and it ended up being $14 to pay that state. I mean, they lost money, I lost money and time, and so there has to be a better way to do that. You know, set a range. You know, if you're $0 to $1 million in sales, then either waive it because it's not worth the time to do it, or just charge us a flat $100 a year or something. You know, and allow us to not have to continue reporting, except once a year, report, you know, our total volume or whatever, instead of monthly, because you're coordinating with the franchise tax board in each state and the ABC, and in every state they don't even talk to each other. So, you know, it's pretty crazy. So regulatory compliance, and then just even the local, you know, ordinances and stuff here, right? And a lot of the, you know, we're in rural Oregon, and you know, this was timber and cattle and, you know, other crops, and you know, I'd say that there's a bit of resentment toward the wineries, because the wineries have really come in and you know, we're taking over a lot of the land, and I think some of the other people that aren't wineries see that, and some of the people that have been here historically, you know, see us as encroaching on, you know, some of the historical aspects of it. But you know, the wine is what's driving the economic development for these counties, and you know, we're pretty good stewards of the land, and we're trying to do things right, and you know, we don't expect to get resentment from our local, you know, government officials, you know, and there is some of that. So I'd really like to see a better understanding, and you know, we're here, we're not going away. We employ the most people, we pay the most taxes, we give back to the community in huge ways, and you know, we're good stewards of the land. So, you know, I'd like to see people work with us a little bit better in the local government and the state, both.
What about as you look ahead for yourself and for your business? Clearly, we're here on your new site, in your guest house. You're acquiring a vineyard here. So, as you look ahead for yourself and for Utopia, what do you see? What are you kind of hoping for?
Well, you know, I want to make about 5,000 cases a year. So these new vines will get me to that level, and at that level, I can still do everything myself. And so, you know, it's a natural progression for us. You know, I was paying a lease at another winery. And when you're making 3,000 cases a year and you're paying by the ton, that's a significant capital outlay every year to make your wine at somebody else's winery. So, at a certain point, it makes sense to take that capital, invest it in your own asset. And so that's what drove this decision. And then finding the ideal property again within Ribbon Ridge. I had the same type of epiphany when I came here and saw that building and realized, that I could take this existing structure in a very short period of time, turn it into pretty much a state-of-the-art winery with, with headroom for growth capacity and everything else that I'm going to need as I increase my production over the next, 10 to 20 years. Because I expect it to be very incremental, just like it was down below, so that it can be managed correctly with all the challenges and, other things like climate change and other things that are coming that are already affecting us.
Are you planning on planting anything different here, or are you sticking with?
It's a good question. There's so many options, right? So, I definitely want to do some different things to make it interesting for me and fun. Because in the end of the day, if you're not having fun, then it's way too much work to not have fun. And so it's a great lifestyle. If it's something that you enjoy, if you enjoy the farming and the winemaking and what that delivers in terms of your lifestyle and stuff, which I do obviously. And, it hits all my buttons. I make my living. I'm a good steward of the land. We're preserving it for future generations. We're giving back to the community. All of these things that are important and are important to me. Wine does that. Farming and winemaking does that for me. So I want to pass that on, and I want to continue to make it fun. And so that means different varieties, and it'd be 10, 12 years before these vines are even mature. So by that time, I think we can probably ripen some different varieties here. And so I'm looking at all kinds of different options. I like everything good. So we look for some more. I like Rhone, I like Bordeaux, I want to do something that's unique and different for this property. So I'm doing a lot of research right now on that.
So you mentioned bringing your family up here. Did your daughters come around to rural
Yes,
Oregon?
They all love Oregon. It only took about 6 months, and they all figured it out. And my oldest daughter works for me full time, and then my two other daughters, they all have stayed in Oregon. They're all graduated and married and working in their careers, and they've all decided that Oregon is where they want to be. So it worked out pretty well, and it's great having them nearby. One of my son-in-laws also works for me part-time during the in the tasting room during the summers and the high season, and I'll probably bring him on full-time at some point now. And then the other, my other daughters and their husbands, one did the electrical in my winery because he's an electrician, and another one, eventually I'm going to bring them all into the business, right? And that's part of the legacy. But they all help out when we do, in the summertime we do all kinds of events, and we have lots of guests, and so they come and they serve and they, pour the wines and clear the tables, and they help us out. So everybody's involved at some level or another. I don't have any employees that aren't family.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
It's pretty awesome. So that's all the questions that I have for you. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have asked? Anything we didn't cover today that you'd like to have covered?
I think you covered it. I'm really excited about going forward here in the Willamette Valley. I think that the Willamette Valley still has a lot of promise, and I think it's going to continue to get more recognition as we go forward. And I think it's going to be an interesting future. We're going to see more of the different varieties coming in, and more people coming in with different ideas, and spurring more thought. And I think it'll be this balance between keeping our what's really unique and special about Oregon with the small family wineries and all the really, craft kind of wine, even though it's an overused term, that's what we do. And then see how that plays as we bring in more technology and more thought-provoking kind of ideas with more people coming in. So I'm excited. I think I'm just as excited now as I was when I first came here.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for
Yeah,
your time today.
it's a pleasure,
for sharing your
Rich.
story with us, and
Yeah.
we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Yeah.